The US Supreme Court has ruled that American presidents cannot be prosecuted for crimes committed while performing official duties. Now, it's a pretty complex topic, and I know that we are on day 2 of talking about the US, but it is a big story. So in today's deep dive, we're going to discuss how this decision came to be and why it is so important. So Sam, when we were thinking about what to do for today's pod, there was a bit of resistance to day 2 of American politics.
It is rare that we do the same kind of area of the news 2 days in a row.
It is, but you can't really skip this story.
Yeah.
Like, we were looking at the other stories. There were some really interesting ones, but no story, I think, today is bigger than this one, which is about a Supreme Court decision in the US. And essentially, the highest court in the land has ruled that American presidents cannot be prosecuted for crimes committed while performing official duties. Now, the decision in the Supreme Court means that Donald Trump is unlikely to face charges for allegedly attempting to overthrow the 2020 US election. And we'll get into that a bit later. His lawyers argued that the former US president was entitled to presidential immunity during his time in office, and that is this protection that shields individuals from legal action. And it's been this whole big hoo-ha, and here we are.
And the first thing I think about when you outline this story is actually Survivor on television, because
Never
there they
watched
have
in my whole life.
So they have an immunity necklace, and if you have that necklace on, you can't be voted off.
Amazing. Does Donald Trump have a necklace?
Well, that's kind of my question to you is, in this context, what do you mean when you're talking about immunity?
Look, I didn't have written here an example from Survivor, but I will update
niche.
my notes. I instead had examples of immunity that apply to people like diplomats or government officials. Like, immunity, this idea of protection or being shielded from the law, is not by any means a novel or a new concept. It's just traditionally not been applied in the US. So if we take another example, King Charles III, who is of course the Commonwealth's head of state, he is immune from civil and criminal proceedings. But in the US Constitution, there is no such explicit immunity granted for its head of state, the president. So no president has had the same immunity that someone like King Charles would have. Since the US broke away from British rule in 1776, courts and Congress have debated at various points whether presidents should be immune from legal proceedings and whether they should have those same protections as the Commonwealth affords their head of state.
And it's not a particularly frequent discussion, because it's not particularly frequent that you do have a president who has committed crimes, and that discussion almost isn't necessary in most presidential terms. With Donald Trump, it's a bit different, though.
It is. So, as we've spoken about a number of times on this podcast before, Donald Trump is currently facing a number of different criminal charges. So there are 4 separate sets of criminal charges that he's currently looking at. One case relates to secret White House documents that were allegedly found in his Florida home, Mar-a-Lago. Earlier this year, he was found guilty of falsifying business records to cover up hush money paid to adult film star Stormy Daniels, and we'll throw a link to an episode we did on that story in today's show notes. The other 2 cases that Trump is facing at the moment relate to his alleged efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss, and that was, of course, to Joe Biden. Now, I just want to zero in on those 2 cases for a second, because those are the important ones for the sake of this podcast. So as a refresher, after losing the 2020 election, Trump was accused of spreading false claims and obstructing the transition of power to President Joe Biden.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully make your voices heard. Today we will see whether Republicans stand strong for integrity of our elections.
Now, Trump's lawyers said that he was immune from criminal prosecution because he was president at the time that he committed these alleged offences. Not everyone agreed, and the matter was ultimately escalated to America's highest court, the Supreme Court, and that brings us to now, when the Supreme Court handed down its decision on this issue.
And the time lag between January 6 happening and all of the legal dramas and now makes a lot of sense when you think about how complex the US judicial system can be. It takes a while for things to get to the Supreme Court, but now it's here. What was the decision?
Essentially, what the court found was that presidents have what's called presumptive immunity for official actions. And we'll get back to what that means in a second, but not for unofficial actions. Now, when we're talking about official versus unofficial, this is kind of the big contentious point. But unofficial actions is considered things like personal matters or private behaviour. Now, it is a bit tricky here to understand if this presumptive immunity will actually apply to Donald Trump because of this difference between official and unofficial. It's not 100% clear whether that applies in this case. So what will happen now is that Donald Trump's case, as I said, is still in front of the courts. And it's now up to the judge who is overseeing that case to determine whether the acts that Trump is accused of in the indictment are official or not.
Because they're quite subjective terms, right? Like, I know that
I
aren't judges,
yeah.
but it's going to be an interesting one as they try and weigh up what does professional actually mean.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot of precedent here to be expected, but it will form a huge precedent in the courts, and it will have very wide-ranging implications if the judge on the case does decide that this does count as official and therefore Trump is protected by this presumptive immunity. It will be fascinating. In terms of what that actually means, I know everyone's minds are on the election. So legal experts do say that the decision will likely delay Trump's trials further. And that could mean that if Trump does win the US election, he could eventually just force the charges against him to be dropped.
Right. So there are some pretty major implications in terms of the timeline that's now ahead of us up to November.
Yeah, exactly. So there's now this new doctrine that's been introduced by the Supreme Court in its decision, and that could mean that the decision gets pushed back. And of course, post-November, it's anyone's game.
He could be president again, but I just want to stick with this decision. So how did the court vote here?
Yeah, so it's always important to discuss the makeup of the Supreme Court. I think it's always quite a foreign concept for us Australians to understand the political and the kind of politicisation of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court's decision was split 6-3 between Conservative and Liberal justices. Now, always important to note who those people are. So 3 of the 6 Conservative justices were appointed during Trump's presidency. And on the flip side, 1 of the Liberal justices was appointed under President Biden. Now, obviously, the majority voted in favour, and there is this conservative leaning in the court. So it does follow that usually in this case now, decisions will skew towards a conservative outcome, as we've seen with Roe v. Wade and a number of other issues. But on the other side of it, we had those judges who dissented. People like Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who voted against the presumptive immunity, and she said, "The president is now a king above the law." Very strong quote there. She noted the US president is possibly the most powerful person in the world and said, "When he uses his official powers in any way, he will now be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon, immune."
That's some really strong language from
the
US Supreme Court. Now, of course, you can understand because the stakes are really high here because he is running for president again. Did we hear any reaction from the current president, President Biden, his opponent, yesterday?
We did. So Biden held a press conference shortly after the decision was handed down, and I'll just play a little bit of what he said.
The American people must decide if they want to entrust the presidency to Donald Trump, now knowing he'll be even more emboldened to do whatever he pleases whenever he wants to do it.
And I'm pretty sure I know the answers to this one, but did Donald Trump come out and say anything after the decision as well?
He did. So he posted to Truth Social, which is his social media platform, and he called the ruling a big win for our Constitution and for democracy.
I can't help but remember a comment that you and I made on this podcast a couple of months ago where we described the upcoming election as legal. It's a legal election, and it's uncharacteristic for a US election to be so dominated by these legal issues and by how many times we probably will talk about the court system in the run-up to this election. And it introduces a really interesting dynamic into the race.
It does. I think the thing that keeps coming back for me, though, is that you can still run as president with criminal charges held against you, and even if you are convicted, you can still run. And I think that, you know, all of this kind of legal fanfare, like, to me, that is the prevailing thought, that no matter what happens, even if, you know, he's not immune, he is still able to run for president. And I find that a pretty remarkable feature of the US political system.
I think it's going to be a pretty remarkable year in the US political system. Zara, thank you so much for taking us through that, and thank you for joining us today on the Daily Aus. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love if you could press follow or like or give us a rating, something that tells Spotify or Apple that you enjoyed the last 15 minutes of your day. Really helps us as independent publishers. We're going to be back again tomorrow morning. Until then, have a great day.